I just want to do a quick trigger warning up top because we're going to be talking about race, women in class, obviously. We're going to be talking about slavery, a lot of violence against women, both physical and sexual, and pretty difficult subject to read about sometimes. But we're going to do it. So, let us begin with this first chapter, Chapter 1, The Legacy of Slavery, Standards for a New Womanhood. ASMRxist. I'm actually going to be reading out of a physical copy of this book, Angela Davis's Women, Race, and Class. Well, we have a digital copy up on screen, so that if you would like, you can read along with me. So, we're just gonna start this from the very, very beginning. Actually, let's just look at the contents of this book real quick. So, after, title page, acknowledgments, all that stuff, one is The Legacy of Slavery, Standards for a New Womanhood. Chapter 2, The Anti-Slavery Movement and the Birth of Women's Rights. Chapter 3, Class and Race in the early women's rights campaign. 4, Racism in the women's suffrage movement. 5, the meaning of emancipation according to Black women. 6, education and liberation, Black women's perspective. 7, women's suffrage at the turn of the century, the rising influence of racism. 8, Black women and the club movement. 9, working women, Black women, and the history of the suffrage movement. 10, communist women. 11, rape, racism, and the myth of the Black rapist. 12, racism, birth control, and reproductive rights. 13, the approaching obsolescence of housework, a working class perspective. And then notes. So, one, The Legacy of Slavery, Standards for a New Womanhood. When the influential scholar Ulrich B. Phillips declared in 1918 that slavery in the Old South had impressed upon African savages and their native-born descendants the glorious stamp of civilization, he set the stage for a long and passionate debate. As the decades passed and the debate raged on, one historian after another confidently professed to have deciphered the real meaning of the quote-unquote peculiar institution. But amidst all the scholarly activity, the special situation of the female slave remained unpenetrated. The ceaseless arguments about her sexual promiscuity or matriarchal proclivities obscured much more than they illuminated the condition of Black women during slavery. Herbert Aptheker remains one of the few historians who attempted to establish a more slave. And I'm just gonna look at the notes real quick. Ulrich Bonnell Phillips, American Negro Slavery, a survey of the supply, employment, and control of Negro labor as determined by the plantation regime. New York and London, D. Appleton, 1918. See also Phillips' article, The Plantation as a Civilizing Factor, Swanee Review, etc., etc. Reprinted in Ulrich Bonnell Phillips, The Slave Economy of the Old South, Selected Essays in Economic and Social Histories, yada yada yada. The following passage is included in this article. Quote, the conditions of our problem are as follows. 1. A century or two ago, the Negroes were savages in the wilds of Africa. 2. Those who were brought to America and their descendants have acquired a certain amount of civilization and are now in some degree fitted for life in modern civilized society. 3. This progress of the Negro has been in very large measure the result of their association with civilized white people. 4. An immense mass of the Negroes is sure to remain for an indefinite period in the midst of a civilized white nation. The problem is, how can we best provide for their peaceful residence and their further progress in this nation of white men, and how can we best guard against their lapsing back into barbarism? As a possible solution for a large part of the problem, I suggest the plantation system. Page 83. So, note number 2. Observations on the special predicament of black women slaves can be found in numerous books, articles, and anthologies, authored and edited by Herbert Aptheker, including American Negro Slave Revolts, To Be Free, Studies in American Negro History, A Documentary History of the Negro People in the United States, Volume 1. In February 1948, Aptheker published an article entitled The Negro Woman in Masses and Mainstream, Volume 11, Number 2. During the 1970s, the slave debate re-emerged with renewed vigor. Eugene Genovese published Jordan Roll, The World the Slave Made. John Blasingame, The Slave Community appeared, as did Vogel and Engerman's Ill-Conceived Time on the Cross, and Herbert Gutman's monumental Black Family in Slavery and Freedom. Responding to this rejuvenated debate, Stanley Elkins decided it was time to publish an expanded edition of his 1959 study, Slavery. Conspicuously absent from the flurry of publications is a book expressly devoted to slave women. Those of us who have anxiously awaited a serious study of the black woman during slavery remain, so far, disappointed. It has been equally disappointing to discover that, with the exception of the traditionally debatable questions of promiscuity versus marriage and forced versus voluntary sex with white men, scant attention has been focused on women by the authors of these new books. The most enlightening of all these recent studies is Herbert Gutman's investigation of the black family. In furnishing documentary evidence that the family's vitality proved stronger than the dehumanizing rigors of slavery, Gutman has dethroned the black matriarchy thesis popularized by Daniel Moynihan et al. In 1965. Yet, since his observation about slave women are generally designed to confirm their wifely propensities, the implication is drawn that they differed from their white counterparts only to the extent that their domestic aspirations were thwarted by the exigencies of the slave system. communal sexual freedom, they eventually settled into permanent marriage and built families based as much on their husband's input as on their own. Gutman's cogent and well-documented arguments against the matriarchy thesis are extremely valuable, but how much more powerful his book might have been had he concretely explored the multidimensional role of black women within the family and within the slave community as a whole. If and when a historian sets the record straight on the experiences of enslaved black women, she or he will have performed an inestimable service. It is not for the sake of historical accuracy alone that such a study should be conducted, for lessons can be gleaned from the slave era, which will shed light upon black women's and all women's current battle for emancipation. As a layperson, I can only propose some tentative ideas which might possibly guide a re-examination of the history of black women during slavery. Proportionately, more black women have always worked outside their homes than their white sisters. The enormous space that work occupies in black women's lives today follows a pattern established during the earliest days of slavery. As slaves, compulsory labor overshadowed every other aspect of women's existence. It would seem, therefore, that the starting point for any exploration of black women's lives under slavery would be an appraisal of their role as workers. The slave system defined black people as chattel, since women, no less than men, were viewed as profitable labor units. They might as well have been genderless as far as the slaveholders were concerned. In the words of one scholar, quote, "The slave woman was first a full-time worker for her owner, and only incidentally a wife, mother, and homemaker," end quote. Judged by the evolving 19th century ideology of femininity, which emphasized women's roles as nurturing mothers and gentle companions and housekeepers for their husbands, black women were practically anomalies. And there's a note here. This quote is C.W.E.B. Du Bois, The Damnation of Women, Chapter 7 of Dark Water. New York Harcourt, Brasenau, 1920. Though black women enjoyed few of the dubious benefits of the ideology of womanhood, it is sometimes assumed that the typical female slave was a house servant, either a cook, maid, or mammy for the children in the big house. Uncle Tom and Sambo have always found faithful companions in Aunt Jemima and the black mammy, stereotypes which presume to capture the essence of the black woman's role during slavery. As is so often the case, the reality is actually the diametrical opposition of the myth. Like the majority of slave men, slave women, for the most part, were field workers. While a significant proportion of border state slaves may have been house servants, slaves in the Deep South, the real home of the slaveocracy, were predominantly agricultural workers. Around the middle of the 19th century, 7 out of 8 slaves, men and women alike, were field workers. This is... I misspoke. So, that previous note, the quote on the homemaker, is... I misread. I was reading the... Let's pull that up on screen, I guess. I was accidentally read, number 9, in stamp the peculiar institution, slavery in the antebellum South. And this last note is from the same book. Just as the boys were sent to the fields when they came of age, so too were the girls assigned to work the soil, pick the cotton, cut the cane, harvest the tobacco. An old woman interviewed during the 1930s described her childhood initiation to field work on an Alabama cotton plantation. Quote, "We had old ragged huts made out of poles, and some of the cracks chinked up with mud and moss, and some of them wasn't. We didn't have no good beds, just scaffold nailed up to the wall out of poles, and the old ragged bedding throwed on them. That sure was hard sleeping, but even that felt good to our weary bones after them long, hard days' work in the field. I tended to the children when I was a little gal and tried to clean house just like old Miss tells me to. Then as soon as I was 10 years old, old master, he says, 'Get this here,' and we're to the cotton patch." Note 12. Thank you so much for sticking around to the end of this video of us reading Angela Davis's Women, Race, and Class. I know it was not easy. It was not easy for me to read, definitely, but thank you for sticking around. If you would like to check out all of my other stuff, you can follow me on Twitch and Twitter, where I stream and say dumb stuff.